Hello friends, in this video I will explain you about transaction cost theory. So before going into details about transaction cost theory, I will explain about transaction costs. So the cost of negotiating, monitoring and governing exchanges between people. Okay. So the cost of negotiating, monitoring and governing exchanges between people is transaction cost. Okay, so in the organization there is a cost, means there is a cost of negotiating. People negotiate among each other in the organization and among organization, and monitor means one organization monitor the other, and inside the organization also different employees are monitored, and governing exchanges between people. And exchanges happen means wherever there it is the existence of any organization, there is exchanges. Okay, because without any exchange it is not possible that the organization can function. So we can say the cost of negotiating, monitoring and governing exchanges between people, that is cost, a transaction cost. So according to transaction cost theory, the goal of the organization is to minimize the cost of exchanging resources in the environment and the cost of managing exchanges inside the organization. So according to this transaction cost theory, so the goal of the organization is to minimize the transaction cost. Okay, so here given the goal of the organization is to minimize the cost of exchanging resources. So the cost of exchanging resources is transaction cost. So that's why here the goal it is to minimize the cost of exchanging resources in the environment and the cost of managing exchanges inside. It means inside the organization also whatever it is the cost, and whatever it is the cost outside, it means in the environment. So the goal it is to minimize those costs. Okay, so that is according to transaction cost theory. Sources of transaction cost. So what are different sources of transaction cost? Transaction costs result from a combination of human and environmental factors. Okay, so whatever different types of transaction costs we come across, so those all costs are due to combination of human and environmental factors. So what are those human and environmental factors? The first given, environmental uncertainty and bounded rationality. First given, environmental uncertainty and bounded rationality. So how environmental uncertainty and bounded rationality is the source of transaction cost? Now you see, the environment is characterized by considerable uncertainty and complexity. That's it. Means the environment is correct, means there are a lot of different types of complexity and uncertainties are there in the environment, and people have only a limited ability to process the information and to understand the environment surrounding them. So two things, so the environment is uncertain and very complex, and people have only a limited ability to process the information and to understand the environment. Okay, so these things may cause increase in the transaction cost. And how these all things relate to increase in the transaction cost? Now you see, because of this limited ability or bounded rationality, the higher level of uncertainty in the environment. So now you see, if there is more uncertainty and complexity, and people have limited ability to process the information about the environment, then uncertainty in the environment will increase, and greater will be the difficulty of managing transactions between organizations. Okay, so this complexity, uncertainty and the limited ability of the people to process the information available in the environment cause the difficulty of managing transaction between organization. Due to such difficulty, Okay, due to such difficulty of managing transaction between organization, there is a cost. Okay, that there is a cost. So that cost here you can see that cost will come under transaction cost, because here transaction became complex and difficult. So transaction must happen, then only the organization can survive. So it means for the survival of the organization, transaction is necessary. The environmental uncertainty may make the cost of negotiating, monitoring, and governing agreements so high that organizations resort to more formal linkage mechanisms such as strategic alliances, minority ownership, or even mergers to lower transaction cost. So that we got there that transaction cost increases due to environmental complexity, uncertainty, and limited ability of human to process those information available in the environment. So there is greater transaction cost. To minimize the transaction cost, what are the things the different organizations or companies do? First given, they use different types of formal linkage mechanisms, because formal linkage mechanisms reduces transaction costs. So the first given here, strategic alliance; second given, minority ownership; third given, mergers. Okay, so these are different strategies which different companies or organizations use to manage uncertainty and bounded rationality, and which result in less transaction costs. Second given, opportunism and small numbers. So how opportunism and a small number related to transaction costs? Now you see, when organization is dependent on one supplier or on a small number of trading partners, okay, the potential for opportunism is great. When the prospect for opportunism is high because of a small number of suppliers to which an organization can go for resources, the organization has to expend resources to negotiate, monitor, and enforce agreements with its suppliers to protect itself. Okay, now I'm going to explain here this topic, opportunism and small numbers. When in the environment of the organization, there are a limited number of suppliers. Now you can see here written there are one supplier or a small number of suppliers, then the potential for opportunism is great. Why? Because if the number of suppliers is low, then in that case the company or the organization has a limited opportunity, limited option to choose from. So that's why in this case it may cause difficulty for the organization to get valuable resources. And for that, if the organization, if the supplier knows about this, that the company or the organization has limited option for the given resources, then in that case that supplier may increase the price. Okay, so that's why the company or the organization has to monitor the supplier's activities and to enforce the agreement, so that there will be availability of resources supplied by the supplier. If they don't expend resources to negotiate, monitor, or enforce agreements, then in that case suppliers may deny to supply important resources which are very important for the survival of the company. Third given, risk and risk and specific assets. Risk and specific assets given. So specific assets are investment in skills, machinery, knowledge and information that create value in one particular exchange relationship but have no value in any other exchange relationship. Now you see here, specific in assets are investments. So what are specific assets? Are investments in particular type of skills, machinery, knowledge and information. Okay, so those knowledge, skills, machinery and information can be used only for a particular purpose, not for other purpose. So that's why there it is a greater risk if the use of a particular knowledge or skill or machinery are going to be limited, then in that case there will be greater risk, because if in the environment the requirement of those skills, machinery and information going to be decreased, then in that case the organization will be at a disadvantage. An organization that sees any prospect of being trapped or blackmailed will judge the investment in a specific asset to be too risky. So now you can see here, if any organization is investing in a particular machinery, knowledge and information, then in that case it is very risky. Why? Because other organization or other companies may blackmail or something like that it may happen. Transaction cost associated with the investment become too high and value that could be, that's here given, the transaction cost associated with the investment become too high and the value that could have been created is lost. So now for whatever purpose the investment was done in a particular or a specific machinery, knowledge and information, so that investment is going to be too risky. Okay, and whatever value it was going to create, that is going to be lost. Next topic given, transaction cost and linkage mechanism. So there it is a relation between the transaction cost and the linkage mechanism. So linkage mechanism, that's I have already explained how different organizations are interlinked, how they attach each other so that the uncertainty in the environment can be decreased, and dependencies, okay, different types of interdependencies can be minimized, or you can say the threat of interdependencies can be minimized. So organization cost, transaction cost given, organizations base their choice of inter-organizational linkage mechanism on the level of transaction cost involved in an exchange relationship. Now you see here what's written here. How organization base their choice of inter-organizational linkage? So different organizations base their inter-organizational linkage mechanism on the level of transaction cost. Okay, they choose different inter-organizational linkage mechanisms on the basis of transaction cost involved in the exchange relationship. Okay, if there is greater transaction cost, then in that case the organization is not going to select that particular inter-organizational linkage mechanism. Okay, so the organization will choose only those inter-organizational linkage mechanisms for which there is less transaction cost. Transaction costs are low when these conditions exist. The following are the conditions when transaction costs are low. So what are these conditions? So first condition given, organizations are exchanging non-specific goods and services. Okay, because if organizations are exchanging non-specific goods and services, then in that case transaction cost will be less, because just now I have explained that what happens when any particular organization invests in a specific skill, knowledge, machinery. Okay, so there is a very high risk. So that's why organizations don't want to invest in a specific skill, knowledge or machinery. Uncertainty is low. Okay, when uncertainty is low and there are many possible exchange partners. So if there are many exchange partners, so what will happen if there are many exchange partners? So when there are many exchange partner, then in that case, if any partner is going to deny for the exchange, then in that case that company may go to other company organization for that particular resource. Okay, so that's why these are the three conditions in which transaction cost will be low. In in these environmental conditions, it is easy for organizations to negotiate and monitor organizational behavior. Now you see here in following is here the conditions just now I have explained those three conditions. In those three conditions, environmental conditions, it is easy for the organization to negotiate, means it is possible, it is easy for the organization to negotiate and monitor organizational behavior. Okay, so that's why these three conditions are very important. If these three conditions exist, it means any particular organization is able to negotiate and manage or monitor other organization in a better way. Thus, in a low transaction cost environment, organization can use relatively informal mechanism. As I already explained, that if there is low cost, so now you can say low transaction cost environment, then in that organization can use relatively informal mechanisms such as reputation and unwritten word of mouth contracts. So when the transaction cost is low, then in that case, generally companies or different organizations use informal mechanisms, informal interlinkage, or you can say inter-organizational linkage mechanism. Okay, so what are these informal inter-organizational linkage mechanisms? So given here, reputation, unwritten word of mouth contracts, like that. Transaction cost increase when this condition exists. Just now I explained that in what conditions the transaction cost will be low, and now here given in what conditions the transaction cost will be high. So first given, organizations begin to exchange more specific good and services. Now you can see if any organization begin to exchange more specific good and services, then in that case there will be greater uncertainty, and that greater uncertainty will cause the transaction cost to increase. Second, given uncertainty increases whenever there it is uncertainty, because here environmental uncertainty directly related to the transaction cost. If greater is the greater is the uncertainty in the environment of the organization, then in that case the transaction cost will increase. The number of possible exchange partners fall. Okay, if there is less number of exchange partners or the suppliers of different resources to the organization, then in that case the transaction cost will increase, because that organization will have to use a large amount of money for monitoring the behavior of that supplier. So in this kind of environment, an organization will begin to feel that it cannot afford to trust other organizations, and it will start to monitor and use more formal linkage such as long-term contracts to govern its exchanges. So now that's what I said. Whenever there is uncertainty in the organizational environment, then in that case there will be less trust. Okay, organizations will not trust each other. Then whenever there is less trust among organizations, then in that case organization will use more resources to monitor other organization and to monitor other organizations behavior, so that uncertainty can be decreased. For transaction cost perspective, the movement from less formal to more formal linkage mechanisms occur because of an organization's need to reduce the transaction cost of its exchanges with other organizations. Now you see, so in which case organizations move from the informal to formal. So why organizations move from informal to formal inter-organizational linkage mechanism. So from informal to formal inter-organizational linkage mechanism occur only in case when there it is higher transaction cost, and higher transaction cost, it is related to the uncertainty in the environment. It means we can say that the greater the uncertainty in the environment and the greater the complexity of the environment, the greater it will be the degree of formality which the organization is going to use for inter-organizational linkage mechanism. Formal mechanisms minimize the transaction cost associated with reducing uncertainty, opportunism, and risk. So that's it. So formal mechanism, what it does, it minimizes the transaction cost. Okay, it minimizes the transaction cost. Formal mechanisms. And how formal mechanism minimize the transaction cost? By reducing the uncertainty in the environment of the organization. Next, given bureaucratic costs. Managers must negotiate, monitor, and govern exchanges between people inside the organization. You see here, managers means in the organization, means inside the organizations, there is a need to monitor and govern exchanges between people. Okay, because so many different activities happen in the organization. Okay, so those activities happen through exchanges among people working in the organization. Okay, so there it is a need, to monitor and govern exchanges between people inside the organization. So internal transaction costs are called bureaucratic costs to distinguish. So now you see, to distinguish them from the transaction cost of exchanges between organizations in the environment. Now you see here inside the organization. So that earlier whatever I was explaining, that transaction cost. So transaction cost, it was referring to the cost among different organizations, among different companies. Okay, and here in case of bureaucratic cost, it is the cost of exchanges, means monitoring and governing exchanges between people inside the organization. Okay, so this bureaucratic, this is given bureaucratic cost. So internal transaction costs are called bureaucratic costs. Internal transaction cost means the transaction costs which are due to transactions or exchanges among different people inside the organization. Using transaction cost theory to choose an inter-organizational strategy. Now you see, using transaction cost theory. Earlier we used inter-organization. What we used earlier? Now you see here. We used inter-organizational strategy for managing resource dependency. On the basis of resource dependency, we learned that how different organizations use different strategies. Okay, that means earlier we learned about different strategy which organizations use to decrease uncertainty due to resource dependency. Resource, you can say interdependency of resource interdependency among different organizations. So here given, using transaction cost theory to choose an inter-organizational strategy. Now we will learn about how we can use transaction cost theory to choose inter-organizational strategies. Okay, or in other words we can say how transaction cost will decide inter-organizational strategy. Because transaction cost theory brings into focus the cost associated with different linkage mechanisms to reduce uncertainty uncertainty, it is able to make better prediction than its resource dependence theory about why and when a company will choose a certain inter-organizational strategy. So now you see here. So here we are going to see, because transaction cost theory brings about focus, the cost associated means what type of different inter-organizational linkage mechanisms or different organizations choose will be based on the transaction cost. Okay, so here the transaction cost, it is a better predictor. Okay, it can predict make better prediction, so it is a better predictor about the organization. So that's why transaction cost theory, it is used in a, frequently as compared to resource dependence theory. Okay, so now understood why transaction cost theory is used frequently as compared to resource interdependence theory for choosing different inter-organizational linkage mechanism. It is because of better prediction. Means transaction cost theory can predict the environment of the organization in a better way. Okay, and can predict more precisely and correctly. So that's why transaction cost theory is more frequently used. Managers deciding which strategy to pursue must take the following steps. Okay, so which strategy to pursue, that decision is going to be best, or you can say going to be taken in the following steps. So first step given, locate the sources of a transaction cost that may affect an exchange relationship and decide how high the transaction costs are likely to be. Okay, given first, find out the source of transaction cost, and then find out how high the transaction costs are likely to be. Two things. So in the first step, what are different sources of transaction cost, find out that, and then after find how high the different transaction costs are there. Okay, then in the second step, estimate the transaction cost savings from using different linkage mechanisms. So different linkage mechanisms will cause a different transaction cost. So estimate here in the second step, estimate what are different transaction costs will occur in different uh, linkage mechanisms. And third given, estimate the bureaucratic cost of operating the linkage mechanisms. So also estimate the bureaucratic cost of operating the linkage mechanism, because inside the organization, if any organization is going to select any particular linkage mechanism, then for that linkage mechanism inside the organization, also a type of cost it arise, and that cost is here given bureaucratic cost. Fourth given, choose the linkage mechanism that gives the most transaction cost saving at the lowest bureaucratic cost. Okay, so what here given, see, fourth step, choose the linkage mechanism that gives the most transaction cost saving at the lowest bureaucratic cost, and only that linkage mechanism is going to be selected for which there it is most transaction cost saving and lowest bureaucratic cost. It means bureaucratic cost, it will always be there. So that's why we will choose only that linkage mechanisms for which there is the lowest bureaucratic cost and there is highest transaction cost saving. Then here given the relatively informal linkage mechanisms avoid the need for an organization to incur bureaucratic costs. So In the organization, for internal exchanges, some costs occur. Okay, so those costs are bureaucratic costs. So if any organization uses informal linkage mechanism, then in that case bureaucratic cost will be less. Okay, so that's why given relatively informal linkage mechanisms avoid the need for an organization to incur bureaucratic cost. So for saving bureaucratic cost, different organization will use informal linkage mechanisms like agreements, contracts, like that. Then three linkage mechanisms that help organizations to avoid bureaucratic cost while still minimizing transaction cost are. So okay, now you say we are going to uh, learn about three linkage mechanisms that help organization to avoid bureaucratic cost. So there it is bureaucratic cost. So how we can decrease? So we can use different linkage mechanisms to decrease bureaucratic cost and still minimizing transaction cost, means minimizing transaction cost and avoiding bureaucratic cost. So what are these three linkage mechanisms? So the first given kiretsu. So kiretsu, it is a Japanese system of, okay, this is Japanese system of inter-organizational linkage, interlinkage. So what happens? The owning of minority stake in its suppliers. And so what organization, what a different organization do? They buy a part, means they buy stocks of the company from which they get their supplies. Okay, so that's what again the Japanese system of kiretsu can be seen as a mechanism for achieving the benefits of a formal linkage mechanism without incurring its costs. I mean, there is formal interlinkage because the now you can see the stocks of supplier companies are purchased by the organization. So that's why here there is a formal interlinkage. Formal, how formal interlinkage there? Because formally the organization has the authority of the supplier company. Why? Because the stock of that supplier company has already been purchased by the organization. So that's why there is no need to maintain, means there is no transaction cost in this case. Second given, franchising. So first I will explain franchising, then after explain the different steps in simple words. Franchisee is a business that is authorized. A franchise is a business that is authorized to sell companies' products in a certain area. Okay, then the franchisee sells the right franchisor. Franchisee is a business that is authorized to sell a company's products in a certain area. The franchisor sells the right to use its resources. For example, its name or operating system for a person. Sorry. The franchisor sells the right to use its resources to a person or a group in return for a flat fee or a share of the profits. Now you see here what happens. What is franchising? Franchisee is a business that is authorized to sell a company's products in a certain area. Okay, and franchisor sells the right to use its resources to a person or group in return for a flat fee or a share of the profits. For example, I will explain in simple word that for a McDonald is a franchisor, and if I want to start a business, then in that case I purchase the authority to sell company's products. Means if I want to sell KFC or McDonald's products in my restaurant, then in that case I will become the franchisee, and the McDonald or KFC will become franchisor. Okay, and whatever resources, whatever, for example, resources may be the name or different uh, things which the company, means KFC or McDonald, going to provide me. Okay, so for that uh, I will have to pay, means a flat fee I will have to pay. Okay, so normally the franchisor provides the inputs used by the franchisee who deals directly with the customer. It means if I start a restaurant, then in that case use I will use resources provided by the franchisor. Okay, and I will be, means the franchisee will be the the person or the company who is going to deal directly with the customers. The relationship between franchisor and franchisee is symbiotic. It's this type of symbiotic relation, because if the franchisor is not willing to provide its resources, then in that case franchisee cannot do its business. So that's why here the relation is a type of symbiotic relation, and that's I've already explained that a symbiotic relation, it is that type of relation in which the output of one company or organization is going to be the input of another company or organization. Now third type of interlinkage mechanism to avoid bureaucratic cost given: outsourcing. Outsourcing is moving a value creation activity that was performed inside an organization to outside, where it is done by another company. It means moving, means whatever value creation activity it was going on earlier in the company, it means inside the organization, if that activity is going to given to the outside company, means to outside company, then that is known as outsourcing. For example, hiring a company to manage a company's, you can say, for example, given hiring a company to manage a company's computer network or to distribute its products instead of performing the activity itself. It means now here in this case what is happening, the company is not uh, managing its computer networks. For managing the computer networks, the company hired any other company to manage that computer network. So this is an example of outsourcing. The specific method a company adopts to manage the outsourcing process will be the one that most effectively reduces the uncertainty involved in the exchange to ensure a stable supply of inexpensive components, to improve quality, or to protect valuable proprietary technology. Now you see here what are the things written here. First, a specific method a company, means whatever specific method the company uses. Okay, so whatever specific method the company uses, that is going to be decided on some factors. So what are these factors? So how effective, now you can see one that most effectively, how most effectively reduce the uncertainty involved in the exchange. If the uncertainty involved in the exchange is going to be decreased, okay, and a stable supply is going to be established, then in that case the company will use that company. So, and that company will use that particular method. So where the stability will increase and the quality will also increase. That method of outsourcing will be used by any particular organization, which will cause a stable supply of inexpensive components, improved quality, and improved technology. Okay, so that's it all about this.